The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So good morning to everybody, or good afternoon for our colleagues in Europe. My name is Paul Fenton. I'm the President and CEO of Montrium. And today we're going to be presenting the first in our new series of webinars on SharePoint within the life sciences. And today's presentation is really going to be focusing on how we go about qualifying or validating SharePoint for regulated applications. So our new webinar series is really an informative webinar series which aims to showcase the different applications of SharePoint 2010 within the context of life sciences. The goal of the webinar series is really to give our attendees a good grounding on how they can use SharePoint within their regulated activities. We'll explain at the end of the webinar how you can get a copy of the slides. We will also be posting a recording of the webinar on our website. During the webinar, feel free to ask any questions in the questions panel. Several of my colleagues are online to answer those questions as we actually go through the webinar. We can also follow up, of course, afterwards via email. So today we're going to first of all be looking at what are the objectives of validation. So we'll actually help define what validation is. We'll also talk about what the regulatory requirements are. So we'll be looking at things like 21 CFR Part 11. We'll talk about the notion of electronic records within the context of CFR Part 11, and then how we can use SharePoint in various different environments such as GCP, GMP, GLP. We'll talk about the documentation model and how we go about defining and developing documentation for SharePoint, and we'll go through a validation pack of a whole series of different documents and look at examples on how we can actually produce documents to be able to support our qualified environment. We'll look at configuration control and change control. We'll actually just touch on that briefly because the next webinar in the series really does a deep dive in that whole area of configuration and change control. We'll look at how we can maximize quality and also maximize return on investment, and then we'll finish up with some lessons learned and best practices. So what is computer systems validation? Computer systems validation is really a formal process which enables us to ensure that our systems are operating consistently and as they were intended. It's a process which allows us to make sure that our user, business and regulatory system requirements have been met. It's a process which allows us to ensure that our information within the systems is secure and is being properly managed. And then finally, it's a process which allows us to make sure that we have proper procedures, so typically SOPs, in place to be able to properly manage the system and also make sure that the system is being used correctly. Now, in terms of regulations, obviously the primary regulation within our industry is 21 CFR Part 11 when it comes to systems management within the context of electronic records and electronic signatures. And 1110A, so section 1110A, clearly states that there's a requirement for validation of systems to ensure accuracy, reliability, consistent intended performance, and the ability to discern invalid or altered records. In addition to 21 CFR Part 11, there are other regulations as well. An example is ICH E6, a good clinical practice, where there's a clear statement, section 553A, which says that that there should be documentation in place to ensure that an electronic data processing system conforms to established requirements for completeness, accuracy, reliability, and consistent intended performance, i.e. validation. ICH E9 statistical principles also refers to the need for validation and system documentation. Other important guidance documents include the PICS guidance. So this is really from the Inspectorate collaboration scheme, where they talk very clearly about what they expect to see in terms of computerized systems validation. What are the documents that they expect to see, and what's the approach that they expect sponsors to take? So that's a very important document which gives us very clear guidance as to what the Inspectorate is thinking. It's also important to note that FDA is part of this scheme since February of this year, so that's also very encouraging because it really gives us a very clear understanding of what the inspectorate expects. Another useful guidance document is US FDA General Principles of Software Validation, Final Guidance for Industry, and FDA Staff 2002. Now this guidance is really targeted more to the GMP type environments as well as medical devices, but it really does also give us very clear guidance as to what the agency expects in terms of validation. So in summary, what's expected, the first thing is that procedures should be in place to ensure that systems used in regulated activities are adequately validated. So we really should have SOPs in place for validation. It's also expected that systems be maintained in a validated state, and the way that we do this is through the use of change control and formal change control, and again we should have an SOP as well on change control. There's a clear expectation that sponsors take a risk-based approach to computer systems validation. This was reiterated this year in the new version of Annex 11 in Europe, which is the equivalent of 21 CFR Part 11 in the US, where they clearly stated that they expected sponsors to take a risk-based approach. It's the same with the CGMPs in the US. And then finally, there's an expectation that individuals involved in CSV activities and the maintenance of validated systems have adequate experience and training. So when we're thinking about our computerized systems, we need to establish whether those systems are generating or maintaining electronic records. And so to be able to do that, we first of all have to understand what an electronic record is within the context of 21 CFR Part 11. And in 2003, the FDA brought out some clarification guidance, which is basically called 21 CFR Part 11 Scope and Application, which really clearly stated what the FDA considers to be electronic records. And there are 4 different types. The first is any record that's required to be maintained under predicate rule and that are maintained in electronic format in place of paper format. So this is really a true electronic source record. The second type are any records that are required to be maintained under predicate rules that are maintained in electronic format in addition to paper format. So this is really your scans of paper records that you're using to make regulated decisions. So it's important to underline that it's any electronic scan of a paper record that's relied upon to make a regulated decision or perform regulated activities. The third type is any document or record that's submitted to FDA under predicate rules. So this is typically any document that's submitted or record that's submitted in electronic format, usually within the context of an ECTD submission, so an electronic submission. And so those records need to be maintained as Part 11 records. And then finally, electronic signatures are also considered electronic records and should be maintained as such. So let's now think about electronic records within the context of SharePoint and how we can identify what would be considered an electronic record in SharePoint. There are several different elements of SharePoint that could be used to generate or maintain electronic records, and several types of entities. And so the first is obviously documents. That's the most obvious because obviously SharePoint is used a lot for document and records management within the life sciences. And so any documents excluding descriptive metadata that are required to be maintained by predicate rule would be considered records. Metadata as well could be considered an electronic record, but only if it's used to make regulated decision. If it's purely descriptive, then it wouldn't necessarily be considered a record. InfoPath forms could also be considered a record within SharePoint if they're being used for regulated activities. Electronic and digital signatures, of course, could be considered electronic records. And it's important to note that SharePoint itself doesn't have native electronic or digital signature capability, even though Microsoft Office does. Typically, we wouldn't sign Word documents which were being submitted to the agency because the agency requires PDF. And so most often we actually see third-party applications being integrated with SharePoint for electronic and digital signatures, and those applications should be qualified against 21 CFR Part 11, of course. And then finally, audit trails within SharePoint would also be considered electronic records if they were audit trails which were being maintained on electronic records. So when we're trying to identify electronic records, there are several points to consider or questions that we can ask. The first is, does the record exist in electronic format only with no paper source? Is the record an electronic copy of a paper record that's being used to drive a regulated process? Is this record required by predicate rule? And does this record drive a regulated decision? And if the answer to any of the above is yes, then 21 CFR Part 11 applies and the system should be validated. And you really need to document this because this is really what the agency is looking for. They want to understand your rationale for validating this system and also to what extent you're going to be validating this system. And this is typically something that you document in a validation plan or within a validation master plan. So let's now think a little bit about how we can use SharePoint within a GXP context. So SharePoint, for those of you who don't know SharePoint, is really a web portal technology. It's highly customizable. We can actually do a lot of different things within this environment, and it's also very user-friendly, very easy to use, and looks very familiar because it really is very similar to what we see in Microsoft Office. Within a GXP context, we can use SharePoint for many different things. We can typically, of course, manage documents and records within SharePoint. We can use electronic forms for the collection of data. Typically in GXP environments, we use a lot of different forms for a lot of different things. And quite often those forms become records, because they're managing regulated activities. We can use InfoPath within SharePoint to be able to transform our paper or Excel or Word or PDF-based forms into InfoPath and make them very easy to manage and exploit within SharePoint. Another area where we see a lot of use is really replacing all of our Excel spreadsheets and trackers and access databases that we typically create within the context of GXP operations to be able to track information. We can actually take all of these trackers and transform them into lists within SharePoint, which gives us, of course, the advantage of having centralized information, versioned information, controlled information. It's a lot easier than trying to manage an Excel spreadsheet. We can also manage the distribution of information. We have obviously full rights management within SharePoint, and we can facilitate collaboration between geographically dispersed teams. As we know, especially within clinical trials, typically the teams can be spread over many different geographical areas, and it's very important to have one central point, and this is really what SharePoint can offer us within a clinical context. Finally, we have interactive workflows, which allows us to be more compliant with our SOPs because we can facilitate the way that processes flow. We can actually control those processes as well and make sure that we're aligning to our SOPs and then finally get very clear metrics and KPIs as to how our processes are working through some of the business intelligence aspects of SharePoint. So there's a lot of functionality that can be used very easily to improve the way that we do things within the GXP environment. Now, all of that sounds great, and I'm sure that all of you are thinking, maybe I could use it for this and maybe I could use it for that, but there are also various challenges which you need to think about as well. I think the first challenge is that SharePoint can be victim of its own success. It's very it can be used in many, many different areas, and therefore it can get out of hand very, very quickly if we don't control it. And we're seeing that the SharePoint is really being used more and more within the life sciences and also in many, many different functional areas, not just regulated areas. So it's very important to have a very good control over that environment. It's also very important to clearly define a controlled and non-controlled or a regulated and non-regulated architecture. and also have proper configuration control mechanisms and governance in place. One of the big challenges with SharePoint, and especially when it comes to things like records management, is the granularity. Typically within GXP environments, we're managing many different types of documents and a lot of metadata, as well as very complex security profiles and write scenarios. And so it's very important to have a good mechanism for being able to capture the configuration and then manage the configuration within SharePoint. It's also very important to properly plan for scalability and have an architecture which you're going to be able to grow within. Again, quite often we see companies that don't spend enough time thinking about how they're going to use SharePoint in the long term, and they get into trouble when it comes to scalability after a year or two of use. So let's now think about documentation and the different types of documents that we need to put in place to be able to properly qualify and validate our SharePoint environments, as well as the applications, both third-party and custom applications that we're going to deploy on our qualified environment. And this really happens in 3 different stages, or at 3 different levels. The first level is really the baseline hardware and prerequisite software level. So this is really making sure that we have proper hardware verification in place, so making sure that the hardware is sufficient to be able to run the various different pieces of software that we want to install on it, that hardware has been installed properly, that it's properly protected. We also need to make sure that our operating systems and our database systems, such as SQL Server, that are required to be able to run SharePoint have also been properly qualified and verified to make sure that they've been configured properly so that we can then deploy our SharePoint on top. And that's really the next level, where we deploy a baseline SharePoint environment and we qualify or validate that environment against 21 CFR Part 11 electronic records. And we really have to do this to be able to then deploy any of the custom SharePoint applications or solutions, or just standard configurations that you want to deploy for regulated applications. And so this really consists of a series of different specifications, so primarily user specifications, but also functional specifications. And we'll go through these documents later on in the webinar in more detail to really give you a good understanding of what you need to put in place. And then also, of course, all of the validation documents, so the installation qualification for SharePoint and then the operational qualification, so that we can test the various different pieces of functionality of SharePoint that we're using to be able to meet 21 CFR Part 11 requirements. Once we have our baseline SharePoint validation done, there's a series of other things that we need to put in place to be able to start using SharePoint. The first is we may use third-party applications which allow us to do other things, such as Cosign for digitally signing records, Nintex for deploying automated workflows, and AdLib for generating submission-ready PDFs. These are some examples. There are other examples of different softwares that we may actually want to deploy within SharePoint as third-party applications. And of course, we also need to qualify these, because if we don't, we could potentially invalidate our baseline SharePoint environment. And so it's very important to properly qualify the installation of those pieces. We then have custom SharePoint applications and solutions. And so these could be things that you build in-house. These are things that you could potentially acquire from vendors. But in all cases, you're going to have specification documents, potentially design documents, depending on what it is, and then also validation documents and SOPs to govern those applications. And then finally, we have our SharePoint configuration itself. And so this is really the configuration of all of the sites and the libraries and the content types and all of those things. And this configuration is really done at 4 different levels. So there's the baseline, so the baseline parameters for SharePoint, the central admin, the user, and the application levels. And so typically for this, we'll have a configuration specification which really defines all of the parameters that we're using to configure our SharePoint environment. And again, we have to have an SOP or SOPs which actually manages the process of configuring SharePoint and then maintaining that configuration. So you can see that there are 3 different levels, and there are a lot of different documents that we potentially have to put in place. Now, when we're validating systems within GXP environments, if you remember I said earlier, the agencies are really expecting us to take a risk-based approach for validation. And the reason why they want us to do this is because they want us to really focus on what we feel to be the high-risk areas of the system. And really make sure that our validation effort is not going over the top and producing too much. Because typically, if we over-validate, we can end up in a situation where we get lost in the details, and in fact, quality suffers. And so they really want us to focus on what we feel to be high risk. When we're thinking about SharePoint, we need to think about how we can evaluate risk within the context of our SharePoint environment and what we're going to be using SharePoint for. And so we do this really in 2 different stages. The first is we'll think about general procedural risks. So what are the procedures that we're going to be managing, or the processes that we're going to be managing within SharePoint? And are these processes regulated or not? That's also an important factor to bear in mind. And when we're thinking about that, when we're thinking about regulated processes, we're also thinking about things like patient safety, data integrity, and product quality. These are the primary factors that we're using when we're evaluating regulatory risk. Once we've actually done our high-level procedural risk assessment and we've worked out which processes we're going to be managing in the system and which ones we feel present sufficient risk to actually qualify or validate, we'll then do a detailed functional risk assessment where we're really looking at the requirements that we'll have defined for those processes, and we'll then identify different aspects of those processes which are considered high risk or medium risk. One thing to remember when we're doing risk assessment is you need to think about regulatory risk as well as business risk. And you may decide that the system presents a significant business risk in addition to regulatory risk, and therefore you're also going to be validating functions which actually meet business type processes rather than regulated processes. Whatever you decide, you have to clearly specify that you're going to be adopting a risk-based approach within your validation plan, and then explain the rationale behind the approach. And so you may decide, okay, we're taking a risk-based approach, but we feel that everything is high risk, and therefore we're going to be doing 100% validation. Or you may say, we're taking a risk-based approach, but we feel that only this process is considered high risk, all of the other processes are low risk, and therefore we're only going to be validating this process. We need to make sure that when we do a risk assessment that it's carried out by a knowledgeable team, and typically this team is going to be composed of multiple individuals from different departments, so typically from IT, from QA, maybe from regulatory affairs depending on the type of system or the types of processes, and then also from the various different operational groups that are going to get involved with the use of the system. And so typically you'll have that group that will get together. It's very important to have someone who's going to animate the risk assessment, who typically could be someone who's independent, and who's going to be able to keep things manageable and sort of intervene when people tend to sort of go too far. It's very important to be strict, of course, because everything can end up being high risk if you debate it enough. And that's really what the role of this independent arbitrator is within the risk assessment group. So let's now talk about computer systems validation and the model that we typically see within our industry. And that model is called GAMP. So it's Good Automated Manufacturing Processes, and it's version number 5. And this is a standard that was established by the ISPE. And is widely recognized in our industry as a good framework for achieving compliant GXP computerized systems, and it's really targeted towards GXP systems. This framework is also clearly stated as an acceptable framework for CSV, or computerized systems validation, within the PICS guidance. So if you remember PICS, it's from the inspectorate scheme, and they clearly define what their expectations are within that document. It's a standard that's widely recognized and understood by industry, not only by auditors, but also by inspectors. So if you can adopt this standard, it's of course going to be very beneficial for you when you undergo an audit. Within GAMP, there are various different categories of systems which range from off-the-shelf non-configured systems to fully customized systems. When we think about SharePoint, we're really talking about a configured off-the-shelf system. And within GAMP, there are very clear expectations as to how we should go about validating such a system and what types of documents we should be producing. It's considered that these types of systems have already undergone a significant amount of testing by the vendor, and therefore we can already take that into account in our rationale for validation. Whereas if we were doing a fully customized system, of course it wouldn't have undergone very much testing by the vendor, and therefore we would be expected to do more validation. So this diagram shows us how the GAMP 5 CSV framework works within the context of a configured off-the-shelf system. You'll see on the left-hand side that we have the various different specification documents that we need to produce to be able to configure the system. And so the first document is the user requirement specification, which will clearly outline the various different requirements that we have from a business standpoint, as well as from a regulatory standpoint, and potentially also from a technical standpoint for that particular system. And so within the context of SharePoint, if we're qualifying the baseline installation against 21 CFR Part 11, we're going to have a user requirement which really outlines what SharePoint needs to do to be able to meet 21 CFR Part 11 requirements. We then have a functional specification which describes how the system is going to function based on the user requirements. And then we have our configuration specification, which has all of the configuration parameters that we need to be able to configure the system. Now, you may have other specification documents if you're doing things like workflows or forms within SharePoint. So you typically have functional specifications, but you may also have design specifications that you add. But just for the baseline SharePoint, which is really what we're talking about today, these would be the three documents that we would need. Once we have those documents and once they've been approved, we can actually go ahead and configure the product itself based on those specifications. And once we've completed that configuration, we'll then do a series of different tests. So we'll do IQ tests, so configuration testing or installation qualification, to make sure that the system has been installed properly in its installed environment. Once we've done that, we'll do functional testing or operational qualification, and this is typically done against the functional specifications. Finally, we do requirements testing or PQ, and within the context of baseline SharePoint, we actually don't do this. We put everything together with OQ because we're not really doing any business-specific configuration. It's all very standard configuration. If you were building workflows and things like that, you definitely would be doing PQ to make sure that the system meets your user requirements. Once we've completed this verification phase, the system can then be put into production. Once it's put into production and everybody starts using it, of course, that's when all of the changes are requested by the end users, because obviously seeing is believing, and that's where we need to go into a change control process. And so we should have a formal change control process which allows us to really document what change is required, to perform an impact assessment on what's the impact of this change on the validated state of the system and what would need to be retested. We'll then go into a configuration management cycle where we'll update the configuration specification, and then we'll go and reconfigure our products using our change control mechanism. Once we've reconfigured, we then go through the same process of testing the actual changes that we've made to make sure that they've been implemented properly, and then we put the system back into production. And this is an ongoing cycle. So now let's look at some examples of the different documents that we would produce within the context of SharePoint being used for the generation and management of electronic records which are governed by 21 CFR Part 11 or required by predicate rule. And the first document that we typically produce is what we call a validation assessment. And this document is a very important document because it really provides our rationale as to why we feel we need to validate the system and what is the scope of validation or the intended use of the system. And this is a document that we would typically present to an inspector or to an auditor to clearly show them our thinking, and this really then is used as our baseline to then define our validation strategy and all of the various different documents that we're going to produce afterwards to be able to validate the system. And so the first part of the validation assessment is really the intended use. So you can see here that we're saying that the SharePoint 2010 application will be used for the management of electronic records within the context of a regulated pharmaceutical environment. So this is really our intended use of SharePoint within the context of this validation. There may be many other intended uses as well, but within the context of this validation, that's what we're using it for. We also define what we consider to be electronic records. And so if you remember earlier, we spoke about what could be an electronic record within the context of 21 CFR Part 11 in SharePoint. And here we've clearly outlined it. So documents that are required to be maintained by predicate rule, data that's being required to be maintained by predicate rule, infopath forms, which are being used for regulated activities, and then audit trails. Within our validation assessment document, we also ask ourselves a series of different questions to be able to ascertain whether the system needs to be validated. And this is based on a very standard methodology that was published in the Drug Information Journal a few years ago and that we've been using internally since then. And basically these questions allow us to define whether there are regulated processes occurring within our system. And so we go through and answer all of the questions. And because this is just for baseline SharePoint, the only one that really applies is, does the system create, modify, maintain, archive, retrieve or transmit records that must be available for inspection by a regulatory agency? And we answered yes, because obviously we're going to be managing electronic records, which would be required for inspection by the regulatory agency. And because we answered yes to one of those questions, the system does need to be validated. The final part of the validation assessment within the context of electronic records in SharePoint is we actually take the 21 CFR Part 11 requirements and actually go through and define clearly what technical and procedural controls we're going to have in place to be able to meet those requirements. And this is a very good reference, of course, when being audited to show exactly how you're meeting 21 CFR Part 11 requirements. And so typically we'll detail out the controls. We can see here this is for 1110C, protection of records to enable their accurate and ready retrieval throughout the records retention period. And here we've described the technical controls in SharePoint, which allows us to do this, and then also the procedural controls that we're going to put in place. And so here we also cross-reference those procedural controls. So we can see that we need to have a backup SOP and a retention and archiving SOP. And so we'll actually cross-reference the SOP numbers and versions here. And then also for the technical controls, we've cross-referenced our user requirement document, which is the next document that we would produce after the validation plan. And this user requirement document clearly describes the various different requirements that we have to meet Part 11. So the next document we produce within the context of validating SharePoint is the validation plan. And the validation plan is an extremely important document because it really governs the whole process of validation for a system. So it outlines the validation scope. So what are we actually validating? What's the intended use of the system? And the risk rationale. So are we doing a risk-based approach? And if so, what are we actually going to be validating? Are we only validating high-risk regulatory risk items? Or are we validating high and medium risk, or are we validating everything? We'll also describe the approach that we're going to take. So what are the different steps that we're going to take to actually validate our system, and any prerequisite requirements such as having other underlying systems or hardware already validated. We'll define all of the documentation deliverables for the systems, including, of course, all of the SOPs that need to be in place. And then finally, we'll define the roles and responsibilities. Now the plan, it's a bit like an SOP. It should be high level and it should be flexible whilst also being very, very clear about what's required to achieve compliance. You should also state very clearly if you're going to be deploying SharePoint in a controlled or regulated and non-controlled or non-regulated configuration, that the plan only applies to the controlled or regulated environment. We're not going to be validating the non-regulated or non-controlled environment because we don't want that environment to fall under change control for practical reasons. So here's some examples of what the validation plan looks like. So the first thing is the validation scope. And so here we're saying that basically the validation effort is restricted to out-of-the-box SharePoint 2010 functionality, which is configured to satisfy the regulatory requirements of 21 CFR Part 11, Subpart B, electronic records. We're also clearly defining what's out of scope. So anything basically that's customized within SharePoint to address specific business needs that are not related to 21 CFR Part 11. So that's really out of scope, as well as any third-party applications and electronic signatures. This allows us really to define exactly what we're trying to validate. We then have our validation approach, so we'll explain the various different stages and what their objectives are. And this is important because an auditor or an inspector will read this to really understand what you've done or what you said you were going to do. Our document deliverables list is really split into two different areas. So the first area is all of the documents relating to the system that need to be produced. So we can see that here, and then afterwards we have all of the other documents such as prerequisite documents, so the hardware qualification for example, or SOPs that need to be in place. And then finally our roles and responsibilities. And our roles and responsibilities typically have very sort of standard generic role names which are really aligned to the terminology or the nomenclature that is used in the regulations. System owner and process owner are very clear terms that come from Annex 11, which is the European equivalent, of course, of 21 CFR Part 11. And then for each of the various different deliverables, we describe who is responsible for doing what to be able to produce that particular deliverable. So once we have our validation plan, it's being, it's approved by QA and the various different stakeholders, we'll then go ahead and define our requirement specification. And so even though this is an off-the-shelf product, we still have to have a requirement specification because all of our testing is going to be based on this requirement specification. And this document will typically define our end-user requirements, our business requirements, any functional requirements for the system, performance requirements, of course regulatory requirements, including Part 11 requirements, and then system architecture and security requirements. One thing that's very important when defining user requirements is to make sure that they're precise and measurable. Precise meaning they're really dealing with one specific aspect of the system or one specific need within that system, and that they're also measurable so that we can actually test them. When we think about SharePoint and the validation pack that we're talking about here, we're really limiting our requirements just to 21 CFR Part 11 electronic records, so it's actually fairly minimal. Because we don't want to test all of the various different functional areas of SharePoint, only those areas that we require to be able to meet 21 CFR Part 11. So for example, we're not going to be testing things like check-in and check-out of documents. We're not going to be testing things such as can I start a workflow? Can I create a Word document in the system? All of these things we know we can do, and they've already been tested by Microsoft. We're really testing things like security and audit trail and things like that, which are required by Part 11. There may be other requirement specifications also which you would produce in addition to the baseline specifications for other applications that you're deploying on top of your qualified SharePoint environment. So this is an example of what the requirement specification would look like for Part 11 compliance. We're basically defining the Part 11 sections. So here we've got audit trail entry components, so 1110E, and then we have a series of different requirements which clearly state what the system has to be able to do to be able to meet the audit trail entry components requirement of 21 CFR Part 11. So we can see that the system must date and timestamp all audit trail entries with the server date and time, which cannot be altered by the user. That's one element of us being able to implement a Part 11 compliant audit trail. And so you can see it's very specific and it's very concise and measurable. Once we have our user requirement specification, the next document we need to produce is the functional and configuration specification. And this really allows us to describe how the system functions will meet user requirements. So within the context of the SharePoint validation pack, this document is really describing how SharePoint functions are going to meet those different requirements. So if we say that, for example, the audit trail has to have a date and timestamp, this document will describe how SharePoint is going to do that. We also describe how SharePoint should be configured to be able to meet those requirements, because it does require a very specific configuration. For example, auditing is not turned on by default. We have to actually turn it on. We may need additional functional specifications if we're going to be deploying validated InfoPath forms, validated workflows, any custom web parts, features or solutions, or any integration with any third-party applications or services that we might put in place. So these would all require their own specifications in addition to the baseline SharePoint functional and configuration specification. So an example of the functional and configuration specification, the first part is really mapping our requirements. So here we can see we have user requirement 6, the system must integrate with Active Directory in order to limit system access to authorized individuals only. So this is really coming from 1110, 21 CFR Part 1110. And then we define the specifications, so SharePoint integrates with Active Directory to ensure that only authorized Active Directory accounts can access the system. So here we're describing the fact that we can use Active Directory to be able to meet this requirement, and that we can also use SharePoint groups to meet this requirement. And so this is how we actually define what we need to configure within SharePoint to do that. We can also cross-reference to configuration scripts, which are also contained within this document. So here we're cross-referencing to configuration script number 9. And that's what this looks like. So this is actually configuration script number 7, which is the configuration of auditing and the audit report. So here we describe clearly how we have to go about configuring auditing within SharePoint. And these are the steps that we would follow. And this is what we would use in our documentation to show which steps we followed when we configured the system. Now, in addition to that baseline high-level configuration of things like audit trail, we also have a much more detailed configuration that we need to do to be able to build out site and library settings, the libraries themselves, content types, columns, security groups, templates and workflows, all of these different elements of SharePoint that we have to put in place. And this is really where the granularity comes. This can be extremely complex because there are so many different parameters that we need to document and then use to configure SharePoint. And so you have to have a very strong methodology around defining this document and then executing it with the various different levels of QC and then also version control and all of those things that we would need to have in place. Here at Montrium we have a strong methodology for doing that, as well as a document template that we use, which allows us to define all of these things and then also make all of the cross-references between them, and then we use that to be able to configure our baseline SharePoint environments for the various different applications within GXP environments. And these specification documents are versioned, and every time we want to make an update we have to go through change control. So this is an example. This is actually just one page out of probably around 15 different pages of configuration information. And this page is really the matrix that we use to define all of our content types. So here we can see that we have a lot of content types which are related to clinical. And then across the top here we have all of the different metadata columns that we've configured in the system. And then within the matrix we define what metadata columns have to be applied to which content types, and whether these metadata columns are either optional, so an O is optional, or R, which is required. And so this is one example of many of the different things that we have to do to be able to define the configuration before we can actually go ahead and configure SharePoint. So once we have all of that, the next document is the traceability matrix. And the traceability matrix is a very, very important document because it allows us to link everything together. It's also a document that's maintained throughout the lifetime of the system, and it's a living document. It's actually going to be updated on a regular basis. And this document really links all of our test scripts to our user and functional requirements. and it allows us to show that all of our requirements have been adequately tested. This is a document, as I said, that's living and therefore has to be versioned as well, and it needs to be updated if we make changes through change control. So this is an example of what the traceability matrix looks like. So we have our user requirements, we then have our specifications, and then we have the test scripts that we've used to actually test those specifications and those requirements. So it gives us a link between all three sets of documents. So once we've got all of that, we now go into our testing phase. So we've got a configured system, we've got all of our configuration documents and our specification documents, we've got our traceability matrix, we've written our test scripts, and so now we need to go ahead and execute them. And the first set of test scripts that we're going to be dealing with is our configuration testing, or our installation qualification. And this document really ensures that all of the software modules have been installed correctly. Within the scripts, we'll actually have step-by-step instructions on how to actually install the software, as well as the expected results. We'll also use this to record all of the parameters that we've used during installation. This allows us also to ensure the proper verification of all of the structural elements using our configuration specification, so the QC of the configuration. And it's strongly recommended that you develop an IQ protocol as well, which explains how the IQ should be executed, both for the overall installation of SharePoint as well as the SharePoint configuration process. So this is an example of what OQ looks like. So the first thing we have is really the recording of the various different parameters that we need for our system, so we can see things such as the hardware model, the machine names, the IP addresses, all of those things. We then have step-by-step instructions on how to actually install SharePoint from a regulated standpoint. Once we've got SharePoint installed, we then go into our functional testing, so our OQ. And OQ typically is end-to-end positive and negative testing. So we're going to be doing negative testing to make sure that the system is responding correctly to incorrect operational errors. The primary purpose of this is to make sure that all of our hardware and software components are all operating as intended. And these tests are really executed on the base functionality of SharePoint, typically by end users and IT. Sometimes it's just IT, but quite often end users will also get involved, and it's a good thing for them to get involved. All of these tests are governed by a test protocol, which tells us exactly how to execute them, and also how to manage deviations or errors that occur during testing. Test scripts are usually broken down by functional area, so we're going to be looking at different functions of the system, and these test scripts need to be approved before they're executed. Once they're being executed, it's extremely important that good documentation practices are being used, so ALCOA, so test scripts need to be accurate, legible, contemporaneous, original, and attributable. Test scripts serve as a mechanism to verify that the system is really operating in its installed environment, and these would be shown during an inspection. So this is an example of OQ test script. So the first thing that we have is a whole series of different prerequisites that we need to establish, including parameters for testing. So we'll need to describe the library that we're testing in, the URL, things like that. We'll then have the detailed test steps that we need to follow, including when we need to collect evidence, and typically we'll cross-reference evidence in the form of logs or screen captures to the actual test script itself. We'll indicate what the actual result was, whether there was a pass or fail, and then also who actually performed the test, as sometimes tests can be performed by multiple people. The final set of testing, and as I mentioned earlier, this is not required for baseline SharePoint. It's only really required once you start deploying custom elements such as workflows or forms, and this is our requirements testing, or PQ. And so requirements testing really consists of just positive testing on company-specific configurations and user requirements. And these tests are typically executed on business-specific functionality. And so we'll typically be executing them in a very sort of procedural way. These tests are governed by a test protocol as well, which again gives us instructions on how to perform those tests and how to manage deviations. The tests are broken down into business processes, so typically you'll follow a complete business process throughout the test script to make sure that the system has properly implemented the business processes that you defined in your requirements. The test scripts again have to follow good documentation practices, so they have to be Alcoa. These test scripts in most cases are always executed by end users, and again as a reminder, you don't need to do PQ for baseline SharePoint validation. So once we've completed our validation, the final thing that we need to do is put together a validation summary report. And this is again a very important document, and is typically a document that would be looked at as soon as the inspector comes in or the auditor comes in. It's one of the first documents they're going to look at to really understand what happened during validation. So it will describe exactly what occurred. It will describe the various different deviations which were experienced, and it will also give their status. It will show that those deviations were properly closed. It will also indicate the rounds of testing that occurred, and then it will provide final approval of the documentation package, which allows the system to go into production. In some instances, depending on your SOP, you may also want to have a release memo. It depends on the organization. Now, you can do one large summary report, or you can do individual summary reports for each stage of testing, and then you can just summarize those individual summary reports. It's really up to you, and again, quite often your CSV SOP will dictate this. The primary objective of the summary report is really to show that you followed your validation plan as you defined it, as well as the protocols, and that you've met the acceptance criteria to be able to put that system into production, so the system is meeting its intended use. So once we have a system in production, we have to have proper configuration control to be able to maintain the validated state. And so this really should be in a specific procedure for SharePoint environments, which allows us to actually define how we manage the SharePoint configuration. The procedure really should govern any update to the configuration of SharePoint, be it workflows and forms, or just the standard configuration, such as content types or columns. The configuration specification should really allow us to clearly document any updates and additions to SharePoint through versioning. We should be able to see how that environment has evolved over time. That's very important if we're trying to trace back if there's ever a problem. We also need to make sure that any changes are documented within the change control process, so on a change control form usually. And then any significant changes, so if you're adding a whole new area of functionality, or you're making significant changes to the SharePoint environment itself, then you may actually just start a whole new validation project as well. That's something that typically you'll decide based on criteria within your SOP. And then for workflows, forms, or any features and solutions that you're deploying, it's extremely important to perform an impact assessment and a risk analysis, so that we can identify what exactly needs to be tested, and then we can produce adequate test scripts so that we can properly integrate any additional elements into the current environment. So we're getting close now to the end, so let's just finish up now thinking about how we can maximize quality and return on investment. As we know, validation can be extremely expensive and time-consuming if it's not done properly, and oftentimes than not, it's not done properly, and we tend to overdo things. And so it's very, very important to define a very clear validation strategy which leverages risk assessment techniques, which enables us to really focus our effort on what's really important within that system and what poses the highest level of risk. And this is really what the agency is expecting to see. In addition to your custom applications, you can also, for very standard off-the-shelf systems, quite often acquire tried and tested test scripts or validation packages for SharePoint and third-party add-ons. And Montrium actually has both SharePoint as well as Cosign, Nintex, and AdLib validation packs available for purchase. You need to make sure that all individuals involved in the validation effort are fully trained and really understand what the process is. Why are we validating the system, and how are we doing it, and what's their role within that process. It's also very important to isolate your regulated or controlled environments from your non-regulated or non-controlled environments. This really facilitates validation because we're really just focusing on those controlled environments, and it also facilitates configuration control because we're not having to put everything through change control, but you do need to have an architecture which will allow you to do this. And then finally, it's recommended to use virtual environments. This is especially useful to be able to replicate your test and production environments, especially when you're doing changes. It's also very good, of course, for disaster recovery. So some lessons learned and best practices to finish up. The first thing which I always recommend to any of our clients is really create a big picture of what you're trying to do with SharePoint, how you want to use it within your organization, not only in the short term but also in the long term. And make sure that you're able to deploy an architecture which will accommodate all of your controlled or regulated and non-controlled or non-regulated needs. Make sure you use a risk-based approach to focus your validation efforts, but make sure you're also strict so that everything doesn't become high risk. So think about maybe bringing in an independent individual who can actually mediate your risk assessment process. Remember that SharePoint's an off-the-shelf product, and therefore you should limit the validation scope to high risk business and regulatory requirements as much as possible. You don't need to test every single functionality of SharePoint because Microsoft's already done a very good job of doing that. Establish a SharePoint validation team and make sure that team remains in place once you've actually completed the validation, because that's the team that's also going to oversee change control and even be there as champions in the use and the evolution of that system. Make sure you implement SOPs and work instructions which clearly identify how you go about configuring and administering your system and which levels of documentation and revalidation is going to be required by the different types of changes that you're going to be making. And then finally, try and establish a step-by-step deployment methodology to keep things manageable. As I mentioned, SharePoint can be used for many, many different things, but it's important to try and break down the various different functionalities that you're going to be deploying and the various different functional areas that you want to use to address some of your business requirements into a very clear roadmap so that you're able to deploy and then validate the system in smaller chunks, which makes it easier to get it out rather than doing a very large project which could last many years and actually end up frustrating users rather than motivating them to use the system. So my final message to everyone today is it's very, very easy to drown in the details when it comes to validation, so try and keep it as simple as possible. So thank you all for attending our webinar today. I hope you found it interesting and informative. I do remain available, and I'll leave you with my contact details at the end. Should you have any questions or if you'd like to discuss any of these issues, I'd be more than happy to set up a call or to correspond via email. The next webinars are going to be in December and January, and so the next one that we have on December 8th and December 13th is on configuration management. So it's really the follow-on of this webinar. So once we have the system in place, how do we go about managing that configuration? And then afterwards we have two different case studies. The first case study is on deploying SharePoint-based eTMF in the cloud. So this is going to be touching on the process of deploying eTMF, so defining an eTMF configuration and then managing eTMF processes within SharePoint, and then also the role that cloud computing can play in actually reducing the amount of time and cost associated in deploying such an environment, and that's on December 16th and 19th. And then finally we're having a second case study which is implementing an integrated quality management system in SharePoint. And this will show us how we can use many of the very collaborative and integrative features of SharePoint to have a very intuitive quality management system just based on standard configuration. And that will be in January, on January 17th and January 19th. So thank you again for your participation today, and I very much look forward to welcoming you to the next webinar, which will be held in December. Thank you.